Did you see the middle class, like the 5 to 7 range? Is that new to not have a big bloated version there? Or like you were saying, is that fairly different this year?
We had quite a few of those. I think what's different this year versus most years is there aren't a lot of those guys that are at the very top of the receiving grade group. We usually have a few just because receivers, there's a lot of different types of receivers, which means you need different types of athletic profiles. They're not all going to be, super, super athletic guys, and they don't need to be. But this year, the guys that we got generally tended to be those super athletic guys. We didn't really have a whole lot of guys in that mid range that are ranked super high. There's still a bunch of them in the mid rounds, and we might see a couple of them day two. But for the most part, it's just kind of where this year has landed in terms of the guys at the top versus the guys in the middle.
So would you agree that based on, what all the analysts are saying, does your formula support the idea that this is a very top-heavy class in terms of the wide receivers? Because, as I'm sure you know, the Bills are in desperate need of finding one, if not two, wide receivers to replace Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis. So based on your numbers, would it be smart to go after one or even two wide receivers within the first 2 rounds, or do you think you can find those gems on day 3?
So I would agree that the numbers say that it's a little top heavy. Just like I was saying, a lot of the guys that are ranked super high in this class are really good testers. That's just how this class kind of shook out. And it kind of plays out that way as you look at the talent level of these receivers too. Is there the guys that are kind of lower down, they have a bit more flaws, and I don't think the athletic profile really plays into that as much. Again, there's a million receivers every year, and we didn't really even have any guys that were like really bad testers at receiver that were rated in the top 300. I don't think we really had more than one or two. But as far as drafting receiver has the highest miss rate in the NFL. There's no position that you will miss at more likely than wide receiver. The hit rate in the first round for wide receiver is actually worse than the hit rate in the second round for wide receiver. Not by much. It's like a fraction of a percent. But it's the only position where it's worse in the second round than the first round. And it's the only position where it's that close in the first round and the second round. If you're going to double up on receivers, go early because that fail rate doesn't get better. It gets worse as the draft goes on. We always remember the big hits from the mid and late rounds. But again, there's a lot of receivers, and a lot of receivers get drafted. Most of them do nothing. You'll never hear their names on game day, or if you do, it's every now and again. They don't become stars. So there's always that element of luck in the draft. But in terms of drafting for the potential to actually hit, you want to take your players early regardless of position. But wide receiver carries so much extra risk just because it's such a low hit rate position.
Do you subscribe now to a certain number? So if you were in a draft room, just use the Bills, for example, or the Lions. Like if you were in a draft room, is there a number, like I know we've talked about this at tight end in the past, but is there a number like they're like, man, that is just not athletic enough, or no? Obviously it's a moving scale, obviously based on film, production, all types of different metrics, advanced stats, whatever you want to use. But are you eventually at some point like that dude's not athletic at all? Or is there not really a number that moves you like that?
There's not an overall score that does. Again, receiver is so type dependent, like the types of players for receivers, because you got guys that are your big guys that you want to send downfield, that you can do all kinds of stuff with. Those guys generally have to be more athletic than the littler guys. We like to think about it as, well, if you're small, you better be athletic. And that's generally true. But for wide receiver, it's the bigger guys that rely on the athleticism more. There aren't really a whole lot of guys that win in the NFL that are just big. If you're not fast enough to gain a little bit of separation against the linebackers that you're going to get if you get lucky coverage as a receiver, if you're not fast enough to beat the linebackers, your size does not matter. They're bigger than you in most of those instances. So you got to be more athletic generally if you're a bigger guy. For the smaller guys, the overall athletic profile matters a lot less than winning where you win. So if you have a guy like Cooper Kupp, for instance, who tested out almost dead average for RAS, but his agility drills were some of the best ever. That's how he wins on the field. We look at DK Metcalf, who had a great profile, but he had terrible agility drills, and people complained about it incessantly about his agility drills. And anytime somebody skips the agility drills, they're like, oh, they just didn't want to DK Metcalf, whatever. Nobody was caring. If you watched him play, nobody cared that his agility drills weren't good. You weren't asking him to do those things anyway. You're not asking him to make those sharp cuts So why does the testing matter that he can't do those things? If you're looking at a receiver that is a speedster that you just want to get downfield fast, he better have a good 40. That's what he does. That's where he wins, right? So you want him to have that trait. If you got a guy that's you like him in the slot and you like him being really quick and really agile, his agility drills should be good. Same thing for explosive guys. If you need a guy that's going to be able to burst off the line, if you need a guy that you need to break press from really quickly, those are the types of guys that you want for those explosion drills. You're looking at those individual traits rather than just the overall athletic profile at wide receiver. And because you're generally talking, again, because the hit rate is so low, you're looking at the mid-range and the late and the mid-round and the late rounds. The fact that they have a less than ideal overall athletic profile is less of a concern because you're not looking at them to be these superstars. You're looking at them to be role players, to do the one thing that they do well in the NFL. You want them to do that kind of stuff. So I don't think you need that elite athletic profile, but if you have all the traits, you can do more with a guy. That you have the potential to be able to use them differently. You don't necessarily have to limit yourself in how you're bringing them along and how you're developing those players.
And it seems like this year may be a year where you have some guys that may check a few boxes when it comes to some of the athletic profiles, their film, and it seems to be guys everywhere in the top of this draft. And Brandon Beane agrees with you. He generally does not select receivers. Gabe Davis was his big hit and notoriously is on film saying, I hope he tests poorly. So there's many clips of that. And, he tested average, okay, and ended up being a 4th-round selection who was decent for the Bills for many years. But then, now there's a lot of pressure on him. He traded away Stephon Diggs, and now you're in a situation where, he subscribes to that hit rate for sure because he's not taking receiver in that range. He does not feel like it's been a successful mark, hence why he went out and traded for Diggs in the first place. So the Bills are very, very cautious here. So when you're looking at this profile now and you're comparing it to all different styles, what do you think is the better hit rate? Are you looking at those shiftier guys? Are you looking at those DK Metcalf, certain style, like the Cooper Kupp style? Like what would you do to mitigate like the risk that there is at this position?
So this is going to sound kind of negative, and it is, but it's just because the math is so bad. That's all the really reason is. But you're not looking at guys that you want to hit. You're kind of eliminating the guys that you think are more risky. Generally, if you're looking at a speedster, a smaller, speedy receiver, those guys miss so often. It is such a huge hit rate for small, speedy receivers. And of course, the biggest reason is going to be injury. Those guys get hurt more often. They're more likely to take a big hit and just not get out. And if they do get limited, if something happens and they take time to recover, that limitation that they're going to have during recovery or immediately after recovery is going to be much more noticeable than a player who wins because of his route running ability or things like that. So I would say you don't want to go after those guys unless you know they're going to be a sure hit. You don't want to go after guys with like the bigger guys that don't have the athletic traits. Even if they have good tape, you want to be really careful with drafting bigger guys that don't have very good athletic traits. We got a lot of conversation about Keon Coleman this year because he didn't run a great 40. I don't think he falls into that category because he doesn't win with speed primarily. He's not a speed guy. He doesn't necessarily have to beat those guys vertically with his speed. He's using his size and his explosiveness, which is a good mark when he tested. That's what he's really doing. Now, he didn't test in the agility drills, I don't believe, and I don't think that he would have done well had he tested. But you're also not going to ask him to do those types of things either, which means he's a little bit more limited in what you can do with him in an offense. But if you're looking for a possession receiver that can beat guys with speed, that can get off the line and break press because he's explosive enough to get past his guy when he gets his hands on him, that's a guy that you might look at. That's a guy that you might try to pick. The thing that Brandon Beane has always done really well is valuing those types of positions, and that's where it gets a little tricky. And I don't want to throw too much cold water on it, but Brad Holmes for the Lions was the exact same way. He never took receivers high. He always took them in the later rounds. And one of the first drafts he had with the Lions, he traded up to draft a small speed receiver. So it doesn't necessarily preclude a guy just because they know the numbers and they work it. If they're looking at your team and they're thinking, we need a receiver, we need a speed guy, that's the thing we need. If there's a guy there and they think that's what they need to take this team to the next level, they're going to be looking at that as a guy that they want to win with.
Yeah, and you see Keon Coleman here. You brought him up. He's a very interesting prospect for the Bills. Obviously, didn't do his agility testing, but still scored in the 9 range for his athletic profile. And then you compare him to like an Xavier Worthy. Like if you were on the clock and you had to make a decision between just two completely stylistic receivers, how would you break this tie?
So it go by what you need, right? If you have a quarterback that can throw deep accurately, then you're kind of gonna want both of those guys, depending on how you want to throw deep. If your quarterback struggles to throw into coverage, the Lions have Jared Goff. Jared Goff has traditionally struggled to throw into coverage. Drafting a possession receiver that's good deep, like Keon Coleman, wouldn't really work as much in that type of scheme if that's how they planned on using him, because he tends to underthrow guys deep. When you have a bigger receiver and they have to come back to the ball, that just gives the defensive back a better position.
Right.
They gave him Jamison Williams, who runs 1,000,000 miles an hour. And yeah, he still has to come back to the ball, but generally he's got a good enough distance. He's beat his guy by enough that coming back to the ball isn't as much of a concern. Now, deep throwing is not an issue for Josh Allen. It's not going to be something I think needs to be as much of a concern. So you're looking at, do I think I want to give him a guy that's just going to be wide open, running in that space? You're taking on that additional risk of having a smaller receiver, but you just want him to get open and be open deep. That might be the guy that you're looking for. But if Allen wants a guy that he can trust to go up and get it regardless of the coverage, then maybe they're going to look at a guy like Coleman. Yeah, he's going to have a defensive back there, but you're expecting him to beat that defensive back, and your quarterback is going to be expected to put that ball in a place where he can beat the cornerback. So it falls into what your team needs, and if you're breaking that tie, that's what you're looking at, is what your team needs and which player fits that need more.
Now, Kent, did you say that there's a higher chance that the teams will miss on these players if they are the smaller type of receivers?
I specifically the small speedsters, the guys that are under maybe like 185, so maybe 180 and below,
so like
and really fast. Those guys, there's a couple that hit, but they generally fall into a very limited bucket where even if they hit, they're going to be, kind of good, but not necessarily great receivers. And a lot of these guys get compared to Deshaun Jackson, who for much of his career was like that. He wasn't this premier receiver. His speed was a huge deal, and as a returner, he was phenomenal. But as a receiver, he got good numbers, but rarely great numbers, because it's a limited role. There's only so many times you can throw deep in the NFL. Teams start to pay attention to when you're doing it. They play your offense differently. They start to put guys deep. They start to cover guys more. They start jamming at the line more. They can make it more difficult for those types of guys. It's a lot easier to shut down your huge athletic wonderkin types, your Calvin Johnsons and Julio Jones and Andre Johnsons and those type of guys. Those guys are so hard to shut down because, you shut them down deep. I don't care. I can still run crossers and beat you, and I can run comebacks and beat you. I can get jump balls and beat you. Those guys have so many different ways they can win. If you can get a guy like that, you can win far more often than not. If you get a guy that's great at one thing or a couple of things, not everything, but just a couple of things, you're still pretty good at getting around the types of defenses that they throw at you. Because even if you have a scheme that, okay, if they're going to cover me deep, I'm going to have this underneath route. If they cover the underneath route, I'm going to have this post that I can run. It's easier to do that when you have a guy who can do a couple of things. When you have a guy that can only really do one thing, they're much easier to shut down. And one of the other big downsides to those smaller speedster types is generally they only have the one thing. It's been a running gag for me when we start talking about these guys every year, because every year one of those guys comes out, and every year it's like, he's not just a speed guy. Right? He can do all these other things. And you put on the tape, and 99% of it is speed. It's just speed. And it's like, I really don't care that he can do this on 1% of his snaps. Like, he's probably not going to do that in the NFL. And most of the time, that's the case. Not always. There are a couple. I don't want to dissuade from taking guys that are able to do it. You don't want to look at everybody and put them all under this umbrella. But it is a tendency to have those types of guys and have them struggle.
I'm glad this came up, because I think this is the crux of where we're at right now. Not only for this show, but for the real life Bills as well, as we're trying to find that perfect wide receiver. Because Kevin and I were going to bring this up because we did a quick mock draft before you came on. and we were going based on the RAS scores. We said, okay, let's try to find guys who tested really well for the sake of this episode tonight. So we took Xavier Worthy at pick 28 for the Bills, but I'm a big Xavier Legette guy because I told Kevin, I said, okay, for this, we can go with Worthy because he's the best player available on the board. He tested very well, and we haven't really talked about it much. So I think it's a good talking point. But I'm very concerned that he only weighs 165 pounds because he is what you were just talking about, that smaller, speedy guy who doesn't have many ways to win other than with getting down the field with that burst. And I think the Bills are trying to replace Diggs and Davis. So you're going to want an all-around receiver, someone who can block, someone who has that contact balance. So for me, I would probably pick someone like Xavier Legette because he has that size. He has that freakish athleticism to him. And like to me, he reminds me of A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf. So if it were up to you, based on your testing and your formulations here, who do you like more specifically for the Bills, Xavier Worthy or Xavier Legette?
It comes down to Legette for me for all of the reasons that you mentioned. Really, you got a guy that's bigger. He's more likely to be able to take some of those hits or box guys out with his body. That's something that Worthy's never going to be able to do. Even if you get past the weight, he's just a small guy, right? He's never going to really be able to use his size to create separation. It's always going to be his speed and his quickness and his explosiveness. And those are great traits. Don't get me wrong. Those are great traits to have. If you can have them, have them. But Legette has those, and he's also bigger. So it's not that he's missing something and Worthy has that. He's got the same types of traits. He doesn't have that all-world speed, but there's a million studies that people have run showing that, the fastest players in the NFL don't really succeed long-term. And they look at guys like, Jerry Rice and that fake 40 time that always gets thrown around for him. They do it with Larry Fitzgerald too. If people like to say that he ran in the 4.7s, he didn't. He ran a 4.49. I think Jerry Rice ran a 4.59, if I remember Bill Walsh saying. But they didn't run 4.2, right? They weren't super speedsters. They're fast, but not elite tier speed. So if you want a guy with that kind of speed, you can do a lot of stuff with them. And there are things that you can do with those speedsters that you can't do with anybody else. But Legette's not slow. Like, he ran a 4.39. He's got plenty of speed. That's a 95th percentile run. He's got plenty of speed to do that kind of stuff. You can still do pretty much everything you want to do with Worthy with Legette. You can't do everything you can do with Legette with Worthy.